we're on our way home. We're almost done, and I'll do my best to get us there today. But I do need to start with a little bit of contemporary news, and I guess I'm thinking about three things at the same time. One of them is obviously the information that we learned from the CDC yesterday, which is in a sense unsurprising if you've been following the way in which the Delta virus, I should say the Delta variation of the coronavirus, which I heard Anthony Fauci say yesterday, it's a different virus, and obviously that's not scientifically accurate, but in terms of the way in which the virus affects us, the way in which it is spread, the way in which the immune system reacts to it, there does appear to be a substantial variation from the initial phases of the coronavirus pandemic and the current phase. And we learned yesterday some of the explanation for that, the contagiousness of this variation is substantially higher than the original variation, maybe as much as 1,000 times higher. And it does seem to have a greater capacity to break through the vaccine, to infect people who have been vaccinated, to immediately pivot to the good news. Those people tend not to get very ill, right? And so the hospitalization in the United States from the coronavirus is 99.5% people who have not been vaccinated. And so although people who have been vaccinated, and apparently a relatively small percentage of cases, do end up with the virus, with an infection, they don't get very sick, but it turns out they do transmit, that they are as contagious as someone who has not been vaccinated. And that is causing a rethinking of public health directives around masking, social distancing, indoor gatherings, etc. And obviously, I think many of us are feeling a bit whipsawed by this. We thought we were on our way out of the worst of the pandemic in this country, and it appears that that may not be the case. Hopefully, in terms of fatalities and severe illness, in terms of economic consequences, it will not be as severe. This, I guess, if we're counting, is the fourth wave, fourth major uptick in coronavirus infection in the United States since the pandemic began. And it appears that it may not be as severe as, say, the third or the second waves were. But having said all of that, it is certainly not the case that we're free and clear. And that is obviously disappointing and dismaying for many of us. And I will speak a little bit more about the relationship between this news and the subject matter of this lecture series, and the idea that essentially this is, as Fauci and others have put it, a pandemic of the unvaccinated at the moment, and that there is a very strong correlation between partisan affiliation and rates of vaccination in the country at the moment. So it does tie in with this lecture series, but it's obviously an issue of independent concern at the moment. Two other things in the news that seem to be very much relevant to this lecture series, one of which I spoke with you about a little bit last week in a much less optimistic way than I can this week, which is that there was a breakthrough on the infrastructure bill, that a bipartisan group of senators were working to try to come up with a proposal that would meet the demands of both parties. And that proposal is now, it appears, sufficiently detailed. The major difficulties have been navigated such that the group is willing to recommend it to the Senate, and the Senate voted to begin deliberation on this bill. And it may seem like a strange thing to celebrate, but it's actually very infrequent in the last 20 years that there's been bipartisan support for opening deliberation on a piece of legislation that itself is the product of bipartisan negotiation. I think you've really got to go back to the war on terror to find some similar levels of bipartisan support for legislation in the 21st century. And so I do think it's significant to look at this in light of stuff that we've talked about, in particular the work of the political scientist Francis Lee, who points out that there's been very little bipartisanship in the 21st century in the Senate because it's always appeared that the party that's in the minority might be able to gain the majority in the next election if they can make the current majority look unproductive, unresponsive, etc., ineffectual. And the way to do that is to prevent them from legislating, right? And with the close margins, the filibuster, other procedural rules in the Senate, it's fairly easy for a minority party that is not deeply in the minority to block legislation. And so the Republicans are going to have to decide over the next few weeks, maybe even days, whether the possibility of doing something that has robust support from the public. Around 80% of the public favors this kind of expenditure on roads, bridges, tunnels, the electrical grid, etc., extending Wi-Fi. There's a fair bit in this legislation. There's also a fair bit that's been struck from it. And I will lecture with you on this in the month of August. So we'll be talking about it in detail. Today, I just want to tie it into bipartisanship or partisanship. And the big question for the Republicans is, do they support this legislation, despite the fact that in doing so, they would, among other things, give Joe Biden and the Democrats a win. And it would be, in a sense, vindication for Joe Biden's appeal during the campaign, and especially during the inauguration and early phases of his presidency, for the idea that it's possible for the parties to still work together even in 2021. And I really don't know how this is going to shake out. I think that the margins are so thin, the issues on which this could fall apart are so many that it's hard to be confident at this point that this will succeed, but it's certainly a somewhat hopeful sign that it's moving this far. And I would point out to you that this is a defeat for Donald Trump. Donald Trump has argued that the Republicans should not work on this legislation at all, should not support this legislation at all until they have regained the majority in 2022, and then we'll be in a stronger negotiating position. But I think really what he's saying is that the way to regain the majority is to deprive the Democrats of a victory on this issue. And I think, in a sense, politically, he is correct. But the question, I think, is twofold for Republicans in the Senate, and then in the House, it's a little bit different, the division. The first is the popularity of this legislation such that if they block it, that they might suffer? And the second is this sufficiently good for the country, sufficiently important that it should be done even at the cost of sacrificing partisan interests? And that's been a mindset that has been notably absent from American politics for most of the last 20 years. If the idea of, at points, putting the good of the country ahead of the good of the party is gaining some viability in 2021, that's very relevant to the themes we've been talking about, and certainly important. Third issue in the news this week very briefly, is the beginning of the House Select Committee on the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And as you're well aware, the composition of the committee was contested. There was an initial proposal to create a bipartisan commission that did not garner support from Senate Republicans. And so the House created its own select committee, which of course the House is controlled by the Democrats. So it is not officially a bipartisan committee, but in designing the committee, Nancy Pelosi and the House leadership allowed the Republicans to nominate a number of their members to the committee. They nominated five, two of whom were objectionable and vetoed by Nancy Pelosi and Jim Jordan, et cetera. The reason being that these were people who appeared not to be committed to figuring out what actually happened on January 6, 2021. Their public record of statements about it, their performance in previous inquiries, like the impeachment inquiries, suggested that they would use their place on the committee to spread disinformation, to disrupt, to deflect, to distract. And so they were vetoed, and then the Republicans removed all of the members they had nominated. There are, of course, still two Republicans on that committee, Liz Cheney of Wyoming and Jim Kessinger. I think I mispronounced his name, with apologies, the representative from Illinois. And I think two things. I mean, the first is that the committee seemed to me to be very constructive, that the Republican members in many ways made some of the most interesting points in their remarks for the committee, that the testimony of the four officers who were on the front lines trying to protect the Capitol on January 6, 2021 was very powerful, and that in a sense, the fact that the Republicans have withdrawn from their participation in the committee makes it very hard for them to control the narrative that comes out of the committee. Of course, we have separate media ecosystems, and what occurs on Fox News or Breitbart will no doubt be a very distorted version of what's occurring in this committee. But I do think enough Americans get their sources from multiple news streams that some of this will break through, and that it may be creating further difficulties for the Republicans, at least for the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which is the currently dominant wing, especially among elected leaders in Congress. And so I think what we may be seeing in the last week of July is a little bit of a distancing on the part of some Republican elected officials from the former president, that we may be seeing the beginning of a greater fracture within the Republican Party, with some Republican leaders becoming more critical of their party's stance on the coronavirus and on the resistance to public health mandates as a new and more deadly variant begins to spread. That we may be seeing some willingness to work with the other side to do things that are good for the country, that we may be seeing some willingness to condemn the actions of the president, at least with regards to January 6, 2021, and that this may be, who knows, a short-lived temporary phenomenon, or maybe revealing that there are, in fact, cross-cutting political pressures on the Republican Party right now, that it's not just the party of Trump, because although the Trump base is very loyal, very vocal, very active, they do not represent a sufficiently large share of the electorate to hold out the prospects for long-term electoral success. And so smart, forward-looking Republicans need to find a way forward, away from Trump. We'll have to see, but that's just a little bit about what's in the news this week. Unless there are any questions, I will now jump into what I wanted to speak with you about today. I want to very briefly survey where we've come, where we are. We've been looking in particular at Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized as a way of gaining some insight into the nature of 21st century American partisan polarization. That he emphasizes that much of it is structural and based in the incentives that politicians face, and not merely about the personality and choices of individuals. That increasingly we face a sharp divide in identity, in which being Democrat, being Republican is a kind of overarching social identity, not just a political affiliation, but something that says where you fit in this society in terms of your attitudes about racial diversification, in terms of your religiosity, in terms of your geography, your level of education, your place in the political economy of America. All of that seems to be organizing partisanship. And so partisanship has become a stacked macro identity and not just a political affiliation. That Klein emphasizes race, and the obvious diagram that I've returned to again and again, showing the way in which the Democratic Party has become a genuinely multiracial coalition, the way in which the Republican Party has remained a dominantly white party, puts the Republican Party at a strong demographic disadvantage when it comes to the emerging trends in the United States, in particular to the shrinking share of the overall population that white people represent. That this then is driving, in certain respects, Republican attitudes about democracy and some withdrawal of Republican support for core democratic norms, like respect for the rule of law, not using violence in politics, trusting elections to decide the outcomes of contests over who would rule, and that this in turn then is manifest in what happened in January 6th. And that's part of the reason why I believe that the investigation that the House is conducting that began this week may in fact be significant in affecting the current partisan divide and dynamics in the United States in 2021. That Klein also helps us to understand deep trends in social psychology and political psychology, that increasingly our partisan divide maps onto a psychological divide, the psychological divide between people who are comfortable with periods of cultural, social, normative flux, who actually welcome changes in the racial composition, in the gender norms, in the religious identity of their society, and may even find rapid economic and technological change to be embracing and exciting. And then those who find these kinds of circumstances to be disorienting, threatening, anxiety producing, and that the Republican Party has increasingly become a party that resists rapid cultural, social, technological, economic change. The Democratic Party, one that embraces it. And that makes it more difficult to reconcile the people who are attracted to one or the other kind of party because they have different underlying psychological tendencies. That it's also the case that our society is increasingly viewing partisanship as a fundamental us them divide. And that when we have that kind of divide in our society, we end up with um, a fundamental hostility or animosity that is hard to resist. That this is deeply rooted in human psychology and brain structures, the tendency to think that those whom we belong to, that we affiliate with, are more like us than in fact they are. That those whom we identify ourselves against are in fact more different or dissimilar from us than in fact we are. To exaggerate our side's rectitude, logic, loyalty, fidelity, rightness, etc., and exaggerate the other side's deficiencies in reasoning, thinking, morality, etc. And that this is then again making it very difficult for us to talk to each other, to hear each other, to learn from each other, to respect each other. And that at this point, this kind of us, them, in group, out group thinking is amplifying our partisan divisions, maybe even at this point causing them. That it exaggerates the extent, or at least the perception of the extent of disagreement, the hostility, the venomous nature of the political divisions we encounter. Um, and that this then is reorganizing our politics away from a left-right axis and more into an authority versus cosmopolitan or open political axis. That it is changing the way we think, that it's leading to identity protecting cognition. That if Republicans are associated with a certain kind of virile masculinity that says we don't need no stinking vaccines, right? If in addition to that, Republican identity is associated with mistrust for liberal elites, including those damn doctors at Harvard and the CDC who want to take away our liberty to keep our businesses open or to not wear masks if we don't want to wear masks. If in addition to that, this kind of partisanship suggests that anytime you do something that benefits the other side, allow Joe Biden to get credit for taming the pandemic, you should resist it. You get this very toxic stew that we find ourselves stuck in the middle of, where people are not thinking clearly, correctly about the risks associated with coronavirus and the protection afforded by the vaccine, the very minimal, negligible risks associated with the vaccine, and the tremendous protection that it affords. And as we can see, states that have a larger share of support for Trump are the states where more adults say they're unwilling or hesitant to take the vaccine. States where Biden did better have a higher proportion of the population who is vaccinated. That there's a very clear correlation between where Trump did well and where vaccination rates are low, and that where vaccination rates are low, the coronavirus is spreading more rapidly. Please note that this data is from July 15th. I believe this must be worse now on July 31st. And that although we see a bunch of blue states where it's going down according to the data in July 15th, I think some of that may have reversed by the time we get to July 31st. And please note, not all states are homogenous, right? You can call a state a blue state because the majority in that state voted for Joe Biden, but where I live, right? Upstate New York, Staten Island, Long Island, strong Trump support, less vaccination. And of course, nobody stays in place all the time. And so we interact. And so now that there's a more aggressive, more transmissible version of the virus, it's exposing all of us. All right. So let me just be sure. Yes, and I don't need to revisit this, but this idea of identity protective cognition. If being a Republican means being skeptical about the vaccine, then um, I think we can explain a fair bit of what's going on in our society right now. And I do think that we really do need to be concerned that the fourth wave of the coronavirus, the Delta wave, may be a severe wave, and that it's going to be geographically concentrated, but nevertheless destructive, unfair to the doctors and nurses who are going to have to cope with this. Economically, it may drag the economy as a whole. And most importantly, of course, people are going to die as a result of the dysfunction in American society, our incapacity to act on the basis of medical and scientific advice that in many ways does come down to our partisan differences. Again, quickly to review some of Klein's most important conclusions. Party affiliation is not really expressive of policy disagreement. It causes policy disagreement, right? So the causal order that would be the common sense order. I'm conservative, therefore I'm Republican. I'm liberal, therefore I'm Democrat. I like a government that regulates and redistributes, and therefore I'm going to pick the party and the candidates who offer those kinds of positions. That's not what's happening. At this moment, when you are a Republican, you toe the Republican line because you're a Republican. If that line changes, then you change your views. I'll give you a simple illustration from Klein's book. The idea of individual healthcare mandates, which is, I should say, was an important part of the Affordable Care Act. It was stripped from the Affordable Care Act in 2017. That idea, of course, originates in Mitt Romney's Republican-sponsored legislation in Massachusetts, and then is introduced in national politics by a coalition of 7 Republican senators. And when Obama picks it up, it has majority support from Republicans in the Senate. And within a month, there isn't a single Republican senator who continues to support the idea of an individual mandate, including the 7 Republican senators who sponsored legislation with this feature in it. Why? Because now it's a Democratic policy position, and therefore it must be opposed by Republicans. And you can understand how this completely forecloses the possibility of compromise, right? If your party says, well, we'd like to compromise with the other party, and to do that, let's take on board something that you think is a good idea. And the other party says, oh, well, if you think it's a good idea, it must be a bad idea. Compromise is impossible, right? Learning from the other side, discussion, the things that allow democracy to correct for the mistakes, to take into account that none of us is infallible, that all of us need correction, and that the best way to get correction is to be brought into discussion with someone who disagrees with you. That breaks down, right? Similarly, the idea that expressive interests have become more important than material interests. It's hard to think of a better illustration of that than people refusing to take a vaccine that would save their lives because their partisan identity suggests to them that they're not the kind of person who takes vaccines or takes that kind of vaccine, right? The outgroup hostility, the in-group favoritism that are deeply rooted in our psychology are now being activated by our partisan politics. And that the result is that although it may often feel like we're thinking through the political issues, that in fact often our positions are being dictated by our partisan identity, not by open-minded, independent reasoning. And I won't spend much time on this, but the idea that partisanship has become one of the few forms of justified partiality, one of the few forms, if you will, of allowed discrimination in the United States, and that to the extent that people are looking for an outgroup to blame, someone to assign their discontent on, it is a convenient path available to many people, and is going to continue to inject partisan animosity into our politics. That the media system increasingly operates along these lines. I guess I can't even say increasingly at this point. It just is a fact that because of the nature of living in a highly competitive media atmosphere in which media are constantly competing, outlets are constantly competing with other potential uses of time for your attention. Are you going to watch sports? Are you going to watch the Olympics? Or are you going to watch news? What is it that the news outlet can do to get you to watch them instead of watching HBO Max or Hulu or Netflix? Well, they can give you something that pushes all your buttons, that gets you angry or scared. That tends to be the way in which media attention is distributed these days, and that drives hyper-partisan media that leads us to think, right? Yeah, we're absolutely right. The truth is only on our side, that the other side is not just confused and mistaken, but benighted and vicious, right? That politics and information in these circumstances tend not to enlighten so much as to make us stupid. Getting more information that only supports your side, that leads you to believe that there's only one right way to think about an issue, is often putting blinders on, preventing you from actually learning. That as a result of all of these trends, our elections less and less appeal to independent voters and try to persuade them. There are just too few of them, and they're not persuadable. As opposed to that, they try simply to motivate the base, and the way to motivate the base, again, is to get them angry or scared or anxious, and hence to animate them with negative partisanship. And then the jumping off place for what I think we need to be thinking about today, this produces strong partisanship and weak parties. And that in a sense, strong partisanship produces weak parties. If strongly partisan voters are going to vote for whoever the party nominates, then the party's strata of professionals, those people who in the 19th and 20th century were telling conservatives to moderate their opposition to democracy in order to win the game, who were counseling pragmatism and compromise, they lose their capacity to influence candidates. Whoever wins the nomination is going to win, no matter how extreme or heterodox they are. And so the party is weakened as partisanship grows stronger. And that is, I think, something that's very important to see as we move forward. Again, this diagram, which I think is just so wonderful and illuminating the way in which partisanship is shaping our cognition, right? You're a Republican and George W. Bush is president. You think the economy is doing reasonably well. You're a Democrat. You're not at all happy with it. And then Barack Obama is elected. Democrats all of a sudden become much happier. Republicans become much less happy. Then Donald Trump is elected president, and the sides switch again. And as I pointed out to you, the partisan gap and perceptions of how the economy is doing the day after Donald Trump is elected, or the month after Donald Trump is elected, takes office, is a staggering 68%. And of course, this is something where we're all looking at the same economy, and it's something where that economy affects our bottom line, our ability to get a job, pay our bills, what our wage is going to be. That's not enough to dictate a positive convergence of opinion. Partisanship is more powerful than lived experience in shaping the perception of reality. What should we do? Let me start with Klein's recommendations again. The first is to manage ourselves, to be self-aware that we are inclined to fall into in-group, out-group thinking, to not simply fall in line with our party, to be suspicious of ourselves when we do that too often, and instead to think each issue through without paying attention to what the partisan position on it is. Um, in particular, sorry, in particular, to be critical, skeptical of your own side, to not direct all of your critical attention, all of your skepticism to the other side, right? And in a way to try to correct what might be the faults of your own side if your own side is not going to listen to the other side. That we should emphasize other aspects of our political identity, aspects other than our partisan identity, to perhaps pay more attention to the fact that we are all citizens and that the virtues of citizenship in a democracy include being open-minded, being well-informed, being reasonable, meaning being willing to listen to the other side and to acknowledge the legitimacy of disagreement. That if we think of our political identities as having more than one component to them, and components that perhaps pull in slightly different directions, we may be able to correct for some of the ways in which hyperpartisanship has hijacked our cognition and our politics, bomb-proofing our politics, keeping it such that we are not held hostage by the way in which hyperpartisanship hijacks and paralyzes our politics. And so on key issues like budgeting and the debt ceiling, put in place automatic processes that don't require bipartisan support or don't let one party play chicken or hold hostage either the ability of the government to stay open or the ability of the government to meet its debts in ways holding the whole global economy hostage if you don't get your partisan way. And then finally, Klein, up until this point, has done his best to be nonpartisan. And I think his analysis points to the fact that the factors that are producing hyperpartisanship affect both parties equally. But having said all of that, he does think that the Republican Party has particular problems because they have been able to win elections while receiving only a minority of the popular vote for both the presidency and the Senate and the House. And so that we should do our best to bypass the electoral college. We should do our best to move away from single member districts that make districting after a census so important and opened the door to partisan gerrymandering, which puts all of the power in the primary election and tends to produce extremist partisan members of Congress, that we should eliminate the filibuster, which has become clearly a strongly counter-majoritarian, instrumentalized instrument for strategic gamesmanship in the Senate, and is taking the Senate, which already powerfully exaggerates the influence of a minority of voters, and giving that minority even more power. Consider rebalancing by the Senate by giving statehood to DC and Puerto Rico, and then as a final measure, shoring up voting rights and limiting gerrymandering. If all of this were done, and the Republicans could not hope to win power by gaining support only from a minority of the population, a minority which is much wider than the population of the United States as a whole, much more rural, much older, much more religious, then we might begin to get reform of the Republican Party so that it became a genuine 21st century conservative party. And that's probably the best prospects for emerging from the kind of partisan paralysis that has been characteristic of American politics for at least the last quarter century. Having said all of that, I now want to transition into other proposals for reform. I'll just remind you, there was some background noise and some music, and so I muted everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself at any point you want to ask a question. This is kind of a transition moment, and I'm going to move beyond Klein now to think about the positive roles that mid-20th century political science suggested parties can play when we are less polarized, less negative, less in-group, out-group than our current partisan climate is. And looking at this as a way to kind of set our bearings for other ways of thinking about what we should do about partisanship in 21st century America. So E. Schatzschneider, in his very influential text Party Government, pointed out that you can't have modern democracy, that it is unthinkable save in terms of parties, and that this is because, and this is not Schatzschneider alone now, 5 critical roles that political parties tend to play in modern representative electoral democracy. They facilitate communication between ordinary citizens and representative elites. And they also allow for bottom-up spontaneous grassroots participation in politics, right? And this is the case when political parties are not just creatures of the legislature or solely concentrating on raising funds in order to conduct media-based campaigns, but when they are also active in civil society at the precinct and block and neighborhood level, organizing regular meetings where they hear from people and figure out if public opinion is changing via listening to constituents. That political parties have been extremely important schools for political socialization, that they are the place that trains both citizens and leaders in the norms that support democracy, norms of fidelity to the rule of law, to respecting the outcomes of election. This is what in particular the research by Laurie Bartels, the findings by Zablat and Levitsky suggest has been eroded within the Republican Party. over the last 50 years. And we need parties that continue to support fidelity to constitutional democracy. Um, that they are institutions that make political accountability possible, in part because they give clear political identities to our elected officials, present us with clear and bounded political choices, and then help us to determine who we should hold accountable when policies fail or succeed, right? And so, in all of these respects, it does seem that the idea of simply getting rid of political parties or trying to set up some sort of post-partisan future isn't the right approach. Having said that, there are a number of approaches that involve reforming parties and partisanship. And I want to introduce you to some of this literature. I'm going to pay attention especially to what I think is the most ambitious and interesting book on this, which is by a woman named Nancy Rosenblum, the chair or former chair of the Harvard Government Department. Her book is called On the Side of Angels. It is a work in political theory or political philosophy, but it is a compendious book. It's I think 600 densely argued pages, and it takes into account a lot of political history, a lot of political science as well. And I'll say a little bit about what Rosenblum recommends. Another very good book is by Russell Muirhead of Dartmouth, and The Promise of Party in a Polarized Age. It's a shorter book that in certain respects builds on Rosenblum's framework. And then most recently, Francis McCall Rosenbluth and Ian Shapiro of Yale have written this book this year, Responsible Parties Saving Democracy from Itself. And so to look over these proposals quickly, um, I would point out that one of the critical ideas here is putting partisans before parties. And what we saw, I think, in those 5 recommendations from mid 20th century political science is that political science had put parties before partisans and essentially said that parties socialize ordinary citizens into the norms of partisanship, that that's a leader model of democracy. One of the, I think, big ideas that unifies much of the recent work on reforming political parties is that this needs to be citizen led as opposed to led by leaders, right? And so if we think of parties as the carriers of partisanship, that is to say, they're the vehicles that citizens use to express and consolidate their political differences, we may think again about what role we want parties playing in democracy. And we may be led to certain reforms that make ordinary citizens more powerful vis-a-vis their parties. Things like not only campaign finance reform, such that political candidates are less dependent on private donors, but also public subsidies for political parties, such that the parties themselves in non-electoral periods are able to gain greater independence from private donors. Let's remember that it's less than 250 individuals who provide roughly 50% of the money that finance American politics today. There's a huge discrepancy in the sources of funding in which the hyper rich are exercising extraordinarily disproportionate influence. That makes it such that the political parties are captured and that ordinary partisans have very little influence on, for instance, candidate selection, often on setting the platform as well. And so the political parties of the 21st century actually don't look very much like the political parties that political science was studying in the middle of the 20th century. A second critical idea here is high partisanship, right? That is to say, people who are partisan because they believe that they have the best account of the common good, what is good for all. And that being a partisan means being passionate about one's vision of social justice, of the best form of democracy for the 21st century. And that if high partisans only support political parties that show high partisanship. So if increasingly Republican voters are only willing, for instance, to support the Republican Party if they don't mislead them about the efficacy of vaccines or don't sacrifice needed legislation on infrastructure in the name of immediate electoral advantage, then the party begins to change and become more of a common good party. And so empowering partisans vis-a-vis parties would be another way to produce better political parties in the 21st century. And I then want to emphasize a third point, and it's a point that I think is in tension with Klein and some of my analysis as well that comes out of Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead's work. And that is that the priority of ethics is critical to these views, that the ethics of leadership and citizenship clearly have a dynamic, but that Rosenblum and Muirhead are attaching priority to the ethics of citizens and trying to empower citizens to demand ethical behavior out of their leaders. And I'm just not sure that the structural factors, right, what Klein calls the systemic factors driving partisanship, the structural factors aren't so powerful that they are going to respond to changes in individual ethics on the part of citizens. Let me stop there. I've covered a lot of territory, both in terms of reviewing stuff that we've talked about together before, and in terms of introducing some proposals for reform. I'm not quite all the way there yet, but I think you're getting a taste of the flavor of these proposals. I wonder if anybody has any questions in the few minutes that we have left. Who wants to start us out today? I can now see that a group of you is gathered on the 8th floor again. So I guess that means that you're able to congregate again. That's good to see.
Well, given that the sole measure of success would seem to be power and not the common good, and there is no agreement about what the common good is, what is the likelihood of any of these theories ever taking off and making any systemic change whatsoever?
Thank you, Wilma. And in a sense, you very much set up where I want to go, but I didn't get all the way there this week. And so let me just offer a quick preview of where I will be concluding with, and I do think we will conclude this lecture series next week. And that is thinking about a variety of proposals. Yes, here we go. From a variety of scholars. I won't give you all their names or all the book titles right now, but who are looking at experiments that allow us to not rely exclusively on elections and representative institutions. And that if we have greater opportunity for ordinary citizens' participation in decision-making, in empowered forms of decision making that actually affect not just who wins an election, but what kinds of laws and policies are implemented in our society, that ordinary citizens may behave in ways that are different than officials seeking elected office, that they may in fact be less partisan and more common good oriented in their approach, right? And that there are actually some really interesting institutional reforms that are being tried in a number of countries. Tends not to be the US, tends not to be some of the better known democracies, but Brazil, Iceland, for instance, Ireland as well, have in fact experimented with these reforms and done quite well with them. And that maybe part of what we need to do is make our politics a little bit less exclusively about who wins the election, right? We funnel all of our political energy into that question. And maybe that's part of what we need to do. So to be clear, Wilma, I agree that the proposals from Rosenblum and Muirhead that I've started to discuss are, if you will, idealistic in a pejorative sense. You know, us changing our ethics is not going to change our politicians if our politicians remain beholden to big donors, if it's all about winning, if winning is possible at the expense of the common good, they're going to keep behaving that way. That's Klein's insight. We need ways to change their incentives. And I don't think us changing our ethics is sufficient to do that. So I do agree with you, the critical thrust of your question. And anybody else with the question for today?
Arthur here.
Go ahead.
I have been observing a change in the people, our commentators in MSNBC, CNN. Gradually, I think past 6 months, we are getting commentators who are no longer wholly white. We're getting a mixed population of commentators. I think this is quite consciously done, not only to bring in the voices of the minorities, but to bring in a vote for the Democratic parties. I also notice in the very advertisements, and this is a rather disturbing thing. For a long time, it would appear that everyone and anyone who needs a particular medication is usually white, except when it comes to AIDS. When suddenly all the people who are on the medication for AIDS are largely Black. And this is another phenomenon. I'm not sure of the connection, but when it comes to our social commentators, the change is obvious.
Interesting.
And I think it works toward helping the Democratic Party, who are opening up their media to a variety of distinguished voices, and sometimes not such elegant voices, but we're hearing from the elegant as well as the not so elegant.
And so, Flossie, I have to admit that I don't watch much television news. And so I'm not seeing.
I think that if you do, you begin to notice those changes.
But
they're there and they're working.
I was going to say that you're not the first person who has commented on this to me. Yeah. And I would point out, I do listen to some NPR when I'm in the car, right? And so I've noticed this on NPR as well. Of course, you don't see the face of the person, but you make certain suppositions about the accent or the way in which they speak. I see it, or I should say, hear it on the BBC too. I see it in the New York Times as well. And so I'm not sure I've got a straightforward explanation for it. It's not something that I've studied. I do have a couple different thoughts on it. One of them is that we are becoming more diverse, and although our higher education is not nearly as diverse as it should be, especially in terms of the economic background. And in many respects, access to higher education has become more and more a luxury good. I do think some greater diversity of the graduates of journalism school is now being reflected in who are the journalists that we're getting our news from. I do think it's also the case that in the aftermath of the events of the last summer and the last year, around the killing of George Floyd, around increased visibility to
Yes,
issues not only of police violence, but of racial injustice in general.
yes,
More news outlets feel the pressure. If you're going to be reporting on this, if you're going to be talking about this, you need also to have reporters who represent the diversity that you're decrying the absence of in the police departments, right? And so that there's been some movement in that direction produced by that. Um, and I do think finally you point out that maybe some of the more diverse reporters are not as eloquent, and I would just point out, you know, I speak in a certain way. It reflects my cultural and educational background. Someone who comes from a different cultural and educational background than I do is likely to speak differently. The fact that people like me have been powerful in our society perhaps shapes our received standards for what eloquence is. And
exactly. Yes. And I mention it because it will take some getting used to a new form of eloquence.
there's this famous story about Margaret Thatcher in the mid 1970s going to a speech coach because apparently what was standing in the way of her and the leadership that seemed to be open to her of the conservative movement, given her tremendous political talents, irrespective of what you actually think of her ideology, she was a very powerful political leader, was the fact that so many people found her voice grating. And I do think, in a sense, she learned to speak differently, in part because the expectations on what a leader should sound like were highly gendered, because basically people had only heard
Yes.
male leaders up to this point. And so, as our public spokespeople, whether that's politicians, whether that's advertisers, whether that's media figures, get diversified, our expectations on what is eloquence, what is authoritative speaking, what is the way in which we represent ourselves when addressing a public may also change. And that may result in us being more inclusive in a subtle but important way. If we distribute authority on the basis of our expectations, I'll give you one more illustration of this. When we look at teaching reviews in colleges and universities, we find that white men get higher marks than everybody else, than women, than people of color. Why is that? Well, it seems to be the best explanation is that students have an image of a professor, and the image of a professor is frankly a white man. And so there's a little bit of a dissonance when the person at the front of the classroom doesn't look like the person they're expecting to see, and that brings the reviews, the scores, down a little bit. That's just, something that we need to change. We need to change our expectations. Wilma, I can't tell. Are you raising your hand?
Yes,
Go ahead.
yes. I hate to rain on Flossie's parade, but I'm concerned that a lot of what we see in advertising or in the media is PC window dressing. And it doesn't go at all towards changing the nature of the power structure or the making the institutional changes that we really have to make.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. Yes.
And
I agree.
Wilma and Flossie, I'll just say it may be a little too early to tell, right? There's tokenism, there's symbolic change, and then there's real structural change, right? And are we experiencing mere tokenism or mere symbolic change? I would point out to you, you look at that chart, what's the demographic future of the United States? Can CNN or Fox survive if its spokespeople are exclusively white, and if that means that at least a certain growing segment of the American people are not going to watch them because they're not represented by them, right? I don't know yet, but I do think that there might be in 2021 some forces that are encouraging the diversification of our media, maybe our politics, that are not just token and that could be real. I am working on these issues at Sarah Lawrence College where I teach, and I do think one of the issues here is access to higher education, especially to elite education. Class as well as race being increasingly, especially given the overlap between class and race, barriers to access to elite education and what that does to the composition of the elite, and then to the resentment against the elite by those who are excluded because they can't afford to live where the best schools are, or to send their kids to private schools, or to do all the enrichment activity, or to give them all the tutors, etc., that are required for admission to the 100 best schools in the United States today. Why don't we leave it there for today? You've got a taste of how we're going to conclude. We're going to look at proposals for changing partisanship, but perhaps also for de-emphasizing the importance of political parties, or let me put it this way, the monopoly that political parties hold on politics and our political imagination next week. Please be safe, be good. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
You take care.
Thanks, Amy.